How's it going, everybody? My name is SockBot, and today we are making a bit of a different video. It might not seem different since I'm still going to be talking to you about game creation and game design, and no, I'm not going to play that bit from the video last time. But the way that I went about creating this video was significantly different than normal. So normally when I peruse different forums looking for tips on game design, I find an article or a comment that reminds me of a technique that I personally use when I'm creating a level. And I mean like when I'm creating just myself, or not when I'm creating myself, just creating a level myself. Anyways, so today this video comes from a bout of creation practice that I was doing. So if you've watched a chunk of my videos, or specifically if you've watched my video on chunks, funny enough, which you can go watch here, and you should definitely go do that, that I, in general, am a tech guy. I love making complicated circuits and levels built on difficult logic because I find it really satisfying. It's like solving some sort of math problem, unless of course you hate math, in which case I don't really know how to explain that to you, but the practice on this was on backgrounds, as obviously it is important for me to work on my weaknesses, and backgrounds are one of them. So I decided to practice by recreating a scene from Mario. It seemed like a good idea, and I've done it before, but I tend to forget why doing that sort of like recreation type practice really does help me. Well, it definitely reminded me this time why it helps, because when creating like backdrops and visually scenes in general, I remembered a few things and a few issues that I have, and I don't even want to really call them issues because that makes it seem like I'm hating on myself, but these like places to improve, I guess you can call them. I think that's what they called it in middle school, right? Before they like called us special flowers and then still failed me for having a messy binder. Anyways, yeah, so these issues, I'll just keep calling them, they came up and they involved the level assets and spacing in general. So the first of those leads into the second, so I'm going to start with assets. So a super important part of creating a level and creating games in general is using assets and creating assets. So if you're like me, jumping in and creating a level is a great way to start. But if you just keep going from there, it does become very time-consuming for making every enemy and every obstacle and scenery piece totally from scratch. Obviously, some parts are going to be unique one-off things like set pieces, for example, which I have a video on, but creating more complex levels and scenes, I mean, we sometimes forget that even the biggest scenes in AAA titles like God of War or any game like that, some assets in those are always repeated because making every single thing in the entire game unique is impossible, even for huge companies like that. When creating levels just by ourselves, this problem is way more pronounced. So basically, recreating this type of scene reminded me of how much games use assets like this and how, important it is for me and everybody to use assets ourselves when we're making levels. So to match this scene, I recreated a few of the assets from the whole, Mario universe. So most are really simple, like the bricks and the question mark blocks, but I really want to talk about the terrain to begin with. I'll get to those creepy clouds in a second. Don't worry about that. So any terrain that you're going to make is going to be repeated a lot, and it's way more effective if you make it yourself and make it unique. So in Dreams, we're not really going to have a choice but to make the terrain ourselves, because although it does give us a lot of texture options and a lot of color options, it doesn't have any super detailed materials that are ready to go or ready to use. In Little Big Planet, it was super easy because you could just use the materials that you got in story mode, and that's totally fine. I do that all the time, but the custom terrain is definitely a way to bump the visuals of your level up quite a bit, and it's actually pretty easy to do, and once you have it done, you can use it for the whole level. But that's the thing, you have to make it repeatable. So in Little Big Planet, we were limited by how complex an object can be. I made this shape at the beginning of the level to kind of paste over and over itself to extend the terrain platform, but when I started copying it, I realized that it was way too complicated for the game to handle, so I ended up changing the design, adding intentional holes between the sections of the material and the terrain for more complicated parts like the vine shapes that are coming off of the grass. Still, for that to keep it more natural and to make it smooth, I took the simpler shapes like the rectangular dirt that's under the vines and the grass and the kind of wavy inner vine thing, and I kept those connected between the parts. So there are breaks in complicated shapes, but the terrain is kept smooth by a few different parts which can be extended far longer without becoming too complicated for the game to handle. A side note here, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say like a shape is becoming too complicated, in Little Big Planet a shape becomes too complicated when it has too many corners. And you can check how many corners a shape has and kind of delete some of them if you want to simplify it by using the corner editor tool, which you should always be using, because one of the first videos I ever made was on how much I love that thing, and I may have overused it sometimes and taken longer to do things, but it's still one of my favorite tools, and I know it's one that a lot of new creators don't really use. So going back to the issue of extending terrain assets, obviously you can't have terrain that is completely disconnected for most levels. That can definitely work for, certain less natural terrain, like technical terrain, but since this one in particular is supposed to be more natural, I have to make sure that I mix up the terrain asset every 50 or so large squares, as that's the point where, since it's not fully disconnected, it does become too complicated to copy over itself anymore. And since Mario games have a lot of pits of death, well, that's easy. Those are going to be the breaks between the longer shapes of terrain when it becomes too long to continue. So otherwise, I wouldn't really recommend connecting them at all, and instead, if you're having an issue with this kind of complicated thing, kind of copy a paper-thin layer with the terrain you're copying, and something that's genre appropriate, obviously, so that it covers the gap between the sections of terrain that you're copying. So there's still going to be visible gaps on top, but that's way less apparent than the gaps on the front that are, directly facing the screen. Also, there's a bunch of ways to deal with these kind of top gaps, if you will, and that's like putting things on top of it, other objects or terrain, just to cover them up. So moving into the background section of this video, here assets are hugely important. Backgrounds can be absolutely exhausting to create without assets, especially because they don't play directly into the gameplay. And this is where a huge part for me was just always getting caught up on this background. And so for this practice level, I created the hills, not the show, just the hills, and I sort of added the shadows on the hills from the not visible sun. Look, I'm trying my best, it's practice. So anyways, next up I created the clouds, which are frankly terrifying, and I love them. So small note here, if you are creating a background piece that you spend a lot of time on, like more than these clouds, and it's not going to be seen for a very long duration during the playthrough, bring it to the foreground. Like I said in my last video, you don't have to be scared if you're reaching a bit when you make something kind of weird into an obstacle. This is how some of the best obstacles I've ever made are formed, and that is that they're formed from the background pieces that were way too cool not to explore further. So I do see this technique a lot, actually. If you were around in Little Big Planet 1, or you've played some of the levels from it, you might remember a Japanese creator who was probably the most famous at the time. He was definitely one of the most played because he was always featured, and anyways, he made an enormous crab that walked around and you could ride it, and he made that using pretty complicated tech for the time. And the rest of the sea creatures in this whole sea-themed level were just background, save a select few, but because he brought that to the foreground, he kind of proved that they were interesting enough that they didn't need to be. Anyways, aside from that, let's talk about the last part, which is spacing and depth. The second big thing that comes to mind when I was doing this practice level was that I'm generally really confused when it comes to creating depth in levels, especially in Little Big Planet 3 with 16 layers and with full 3D in Dreams. It's pretty confusing to me, so players can generally tell when a level feels cramped or open, and this can be good when a level is supposed to feel that way, but it's somewhat tough to derive that feeling from playing it to use as rules within creation. So this is something that I've been using for a while, and it might help you. My technique is to look up a scene, literally any scene at all, and after I dive in and create some stuff and turn some of that stuff into assets myself, I end up copying this scene into the level, but only focusing on the spacing of it. I could take this Mario scene and replace it with assets that fit some kind of fantasy theme. Obviously, I wouldn't have coin blocks and that kind of stuff, but at least it would give me a place to start in terms of spacing. If you do this yourself, it might not be totally necessary for you to spend all that time to remake the scenes in-game like I did, but I think it does help with learning to translate the image that you have in your mind into Little Big Planet, or of course, in the future, into Dreams. Still, even looking at the scenes and copying things like grass and other type of sets to help with your assets, or of course, like I said, things like spacing and depth is incredibly helpful, but like I said before, you don't forget to translate it. As you can see when I switch to play mode in this kind of recreation of Mario, the spacing does not work at all for Sackboy. So it's not perfect, and like everything, it does require some testing and some tweaking, but were I to actually make this a level, I would condense everything a little bit and make it flow better that way. But that's honestly just a matter of knowing the game that you are creating within. So like you learn the mechanics that you give your in-game character, and that will force you to adapt the level a bit to the needs and the playstyle of that character. An example I always give is our lovely Sackbird Swoop. And if that's your main character in a normal platformer, well, it's going to feel really cramped. And that's not to mention that Swoop can fly over everything. So all in all, this kind of recreating was really, really helpful for me. I normally prefer to just binge create without really taking time to focus on efficiency, and I'm trying to go away from that. Obviously, we can definitely have fun, and that's super important as creators, and also creating a good level, but I personally want to put a bigger focus on creating assets in my level so that I can spend time creating a level that like flows better, that's playtested more, or even one that's longer than normal, and use my time for that instead. I'm sure there's a way that you can go way too far with assets and create a game where all the enemies or objects are exactly the same. I'm looking at you, Fallout 5. Yeah, it's a good game, but seriously, I do hope that this kind of video was helpful for you, and if you do like learning either from me or alongside me, you can tell me by liking this video and subscribing to my channel if and only if you want to. No pressure. I'm obviously still learning, and I always will be, but that's like the whole reason that I make videos. I want a community to talk about all of this so that we can share all the tricks and the tips and stuff that we learn, so whether someone went from college in game design to making stuff or otherwise, we can all make and stuff more creativity into the gaming community. Alright, that got a little philosophical, but like, you get what I mean. It's true, and yeah, that's about it. Anyways, I hope to talk to you all very soon. But for now, I'm very excited and maybe a bit sleepy because this is a long video, but I will wish you goodbye for now. Bye. That was weird saying things after bye.